we are very fortunate to have Isabela today with us, who is going to present the first paper of the series. And she's just joined us from the US, and she's now in London at LSE. And she's worked a lot on multinationals in particular. And so today it's about responsible sourcing. So Isabela, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Really nice to meet everyone. And I look forward to meeting you in person as well. So without further ado, so this is joint work with Alonso Alfaro from the Central Bank of Costa Rica, Benjamin Favre and Cecile Gobert from UC Berkeley, and my long-term co-author, Jose Vasquez, who has also joined LSE. So the adoption by multinational corporations or enterprises of minimum standards on the working conditions of their suppliers is something that has become widespread. These responsible sourcing that we abbreviate RS going forward policies typically take the form of suppliers' code of conduct, whereby the suppliers of MNEs are expected to follow minimum standards on working conditions, such as wage floors or safety standards. The stated objective of these RS policies is to benefit workers in the countries where MNEs source. But despite the increasing prevalence of RS policies and the support that they receive from organizations such as the ILO, there is relatively little theoretical and empirical work studying their actual effects. So in this project, we aim to study the impact of RS policies with an empirical application in Costa Rica. So first, we ask whether RS policies have a bite on the ground from an empirical standpoint. And if they're not just hot air, then we want to study their effects on firms and workers and analyze their impact on the welfare of workers in the supplier's country. So to do so, we start by writing down a quantitative G model in which MNEs, they impose RS policies, which we model as a higher labor cost. And these are imposed on the suppliers in the sourcing country. The impact of RS policies depends on several hypotheses, model hypotheses. So we first use the model to derive testable comparative statics, which, when brought to the data, allow us to settle on the model variant that is most aligned with what we observe on the ground. We then use the model to derive expressions for the welfare impact of RS, both in the aggregate and by worker types. Second, we present new empirical evidence on the effects of rollouts of RS policies. We study these effects in the empirical context of Costa Rica. So as a background, for those of you not familiar with the country, there are a bit more than 500 MNE subsidiaries in Costa Rica, of MNEs such as Intel, HP, Walmart, and the like. So names that are household names of MNEs. What we do is we construct a new data set that describes the near universe of RS code of conducts that are rolled out by MNEs with subsidiaries in Costa Rica. In our study period, we're able to identify 127 MNEs that put in place a new RS policy. If you're wondering, what is the footprint of these MNEs and their RS policies, a statistic to keep in mind is that by 2017, these RS policies affected 45% of the output of formal Costa Rican firms. We link this new data set with a rare combination of rich administrative data, which includes most usefully the firm-to-firm transaction records and the matched employer-employee data in the country. We then use this data to implement an event study strategy, which allows us to trace out the impact of RS on impacted suppliers and workers. And finally, we estimate the model and quantify the welfare impact of RS policies in Costa Rica. So for those of you who need to doze off or disconnect, here's a quick preview of some of our findings. So first, we find that the sign of the welfare impact of RS on the supplier's country is a priori ambiguous. So what we have on the one hand is that RS increases the input cost for M&E exporters, so that RS acts as an export tax, which increases welfare through a classic terms of trade effect. However, on the other hand, RS does not just apply to exports, but also impacts domestic production. So it reduces welfare by distorting domestic production and increases the domestic price index. Empirically, we find that RS policies are not just hot air. We find that the wages of workers at exposed firms increase, particularly for low-wage workers, for whom RS policies are most likely binding. For these low-wage workers, the wage gain is of 6%, 4 years after the rollout. Meanwhile, the corresponding sales and employment of domestic firms that are exposed to RS fall by 8%. Third, we quantify the model and find that in our empirical context, RS policies have a net positive aggregate effect, with gains being concentrated mainly among the initially low-wage workers, whose welfare gain is of 1.3%. Now, in the interest of time, today I will need to skip the literature review, but there's already a literature to which we connect that has to do with the effects of FDI on developing countries. There's a literature on the effects of RS policies, on the effects of fair trade certifications, and also on corporate social responsibility. So in terms of the outline, I'll start by introducing the model and comparative statics that we bring to the data for model selection. I'll then present the data and empirical analysis. I'll continue with the model selection given what we've learned in the empirical analysis, and then estimate and conclude with the welfare results. So to set the stage, I'm going to summarize our baseline environment. And as I mentioned, we will later discuss extensions that consider different hypotheses on the implementations of RS policies. So there are 2 countries that we index by K. Home is Costa Rica in our analysis, and foreign, which is the rest of the world. Workers have CES utility, with D omega being the demand shifter for each variety omega. There are 2 types of workers, initially low and initially high wage workers. They are imperfect substitutes in production with elasticity raw, and elasticity of substitution raw. And workers supply 1 unit of labor inelastically, and their total labor, where total income is their labor income plus a rebate of domestic firm profits that is proportional to their wage. Now, in terms of the baseline environment for production, the final good is produced by 2 types of firms, M&Es and non-M&E domestic firms. Non-M&E firms, they produce using labor. These domestic firms are heterogeneous in productivity, and the productivity is distributed Pareto with theta, the shape parameter. M&Es are indexed by X, and they're headquartered in foreign and have a subsidiary in home. For simplicity, we assume that they're all symmetric. The subsidiary of the M&E in home combines intermediate inputs that are produced by home firms into a CES aggregate. Now, focusing back on the non-M&E domestic firms at home, as I said, they're heterogeneous in productivity. So focusing on the non-M&E firms at home, they're heterogeneous in productivity, and they potentially have several production lines. One is for producing for the final good market, that is for consumption at home, and other production lines for producing intermediate inputs for foreign M&Es that have subsidiaries in home. To produce in each of these markets, these domestic firms have to incur a market-specific fixed cost, and then they produce at constant marginal cost. we assume that the fixed costs are such that there is a tougher selection to sell on the M&E market than on the domestic market. This is something that is in line with already existing empirical evidence. We assume, for the sake of simplicity of notation for today, that there are simple trade patterns, although this can and is easily relaxed in the future version of our paper. Namely, what we assume is that exporting from home to foreign is only done by the M&E subsidiaries. Home firms do not directly export. And conversely, we assume that exports from foreign to home are only done by non-M&E firms in foreign. So M&Es do not really export their final good at home. Finally, in terms of market structure, the baseline environment features monopolistic competition in each market. So in this context that I've just described, which is our baseline environment, we aim to study the introduction of an RS policy. We assume that the M&E imposes minimum labor standards on its suppliers, and these labor standards lead to an increase in labor costs. This can capture both labor-related operating costs and actual higher hourly wages that are paid to the worker. We assume that the RS policy is binding for low-wage workers that are likely to be close or under the whatever minimum wage, that have worse working conditions, but it's not binding for high-wage workers. In line with standard RS practices, a local firm that agrees to be part of a responsible supply chain must apply the same labor standards to all its workers, including those on production lines that are dedicated to the domestic market. So this is the environment. So formally, what we're doing, we're assuming that the suppliers, they need to increase the compensation of low-wage workers to tau times the prevailing market wage. And meanwhile, the high-wage workers, they receive the prevailing market wage for high-wage workers. Now, quite intuitively, the impact of this increase in labor cost depends on how and why this policy is implemented. So in the next few slides, we're going to consider alternative hypotheses in 4 dimensions that shape the impact of RS policy and derive the corresponding comparative statics that allow us to select the main model that then we take to the welfare analysis. So a first question is, that is relevant for welfare is, why do M&Es implement RS policies? Namely, is RS implemented because it is a profit maximizing move, or is it driven by other considerations? So here we follow the literature on corporate social responsibility, and we consider 2 broad potential motivations. First, RS could be a choice that is made by the M&E management, pursuing alternative motives that are beyond short-term profit maximization. So under this hypothesis, we take the RS policy tau, that is summarized by tau, as a parameter that is chosen in the utility maximization problem of the manager, but that is chosen outside the profit maximization problem of the M&E. So this is our hypothesis A. Alternatively, RS could be a profit maximizing response to an exigence of foreign consumers for fairer labor conditions in the sourcing countries. So to capture this idea, we assume in hypothesis A prime that the demand shifter for the good that is produced by the M&E, dx, directly increases with labor conditions at home that are captured by tau. So then tau is then chosen optimally in the profit maximization problem of the M&E, trading off higher costs of production against higher demand. Another question that is relevant for welfare is whether RS policies are introduced in a context where welfares were too low to begin with. In the baseline model just presented, the labor market was perfectly competitive, so there was no sense in which wages were too low. Alternatively, however, it could be that pre-RS wages were too low compared to an efficient benchmark. So to capture this possibility, we extend the model, the baseline model presented just before, to allow for the labor market at home to be monopsonistic. And this is our hypothesis B prime. So specifically what we do is we simply extend the baseline model to feature an upward sloping labor supply curve, that home firms face, and allow home firms to be wage setters through monopsonistic competition. And the rest of the model is unchanged from the baseline model. The RS policy, as described until now, is only a net increase in labor costs for firms that are hiring low-wage workers. So this is our hypothesis C. However, it is possible that RS policies also incentivize firms to make their workers more productive, or that they come with transfers of knowledge from the M&E to its suppliers. So under hypothesis C prime, we allow for such a labor productivity gain, T larger or equal than 1. I'm sorry, have a cough. We assume that T benefits all workers at RS firms and is passed through to their compensation that is denoted by W tilde. Note that tau, so our RS parameter, still measures the net labor cost increase that is faced by the RS supplier, net of any labor productivity gains.
Can I ask a question or?
Yes, please.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm not really very familiar with this literature, but I'm wondering about how you model this RS policy with the tau. So I would imagine that in practice, I mean, the wage has to be, a certain minimum, and if the wage in equilibrium is higher, then that's fine, and if it's lower, then, but in your model, even if in equilibrium the wage increases, you still have to pay this premium tau times whatever the equilibrium wage is. So why that choice?
Yes, so this tau, as I said, only applies to the low wage workers, which are the ones that are close to the minimum wage, for instance. And it's a reduced form way to put together all the ways in which RS policies increase labor costs. So it's not just in practice, if you think about the empirics and less about the model world, tau does not just capture wages per se, but also captures any other variable cost increases that are associated to workers having to wear a helmet or respect some other type of safety standards, or being paid compensation for sick leave or maternity leave. So in practice, this tau, we will estimate it sort of not from the increase in wages that we observe empirically, but we will back it off from the model because it can capture more than just equilibrium wage increases.
Right.
So last, finally, the impact of RS policies on home welfare will depend on how much of the cost of RS is borne by the supplier versus the M&E. So here we consider two possibilities. First, the cost increase of RS may be fully borne by the M&E. So this is mechanically the case in our baseline setting that has monopolistic competition, hence has full pass-through built in it. Alternatively, we consider in hypothesis D prime that the pass-through of the cost increase to the M&E is imperfect. And we capture that in a reduced form parameter beta that is between 0 and 1. So this parameter beta in future versions of the paper, we want to microfound it. But right now is just a reduced form way to say that that M&Es might not bear the entire cost increase by themselves. So now let me explain how we use comparative statics predictions from each of these model variants for model selection. So in this table, the columns point to the model variant. So the first column refers to our baseline model, which combines hypotheses A, B, C, and D. And the next four columns, they replace hypothesis A by A prime, B by B prime, and so on. So this is what is happening in the columns. Then the rows, they show the predicted sign of the effect of RS policies on sales for two types of firms: the exposed firms and their subset, so the subset of the exposed firms that contains the compliers. So what are these two types of firms? The exposed firms are the domestic firms that sell to the MNE that is about to roll out a policy in the year before this MNE introduced the policy, while the compliers are those firms among the exposed firms that continue selling to that MNE after the imposition of the RS policy. Now, how do we use this comparative statistics? First, you might notice from this table that some hypotheses can be ruled out by looking at the sign predicted by their model variant for the effect of RS on sales. So for instance, if you look at the first row for compliers, it shows that if RS is profit motivated, so we're under A prime, or if it is implemented in a context of monopolistic monopsonistic labor market, so we're under B prime, then the intensive margin sales of the compliers should go up. And in all other cases, sales should go down, these intensive margin sales. So as we see next in our empirical part in the next couple of slides, we will find a fall in the intensive margin sales of compliers to the RSMNE. So sales to the RSMNE of these compliers. And this allows us to rule out hypothesis A prime and B prime. In the second step, we focus on the remaining modeling assumptions, namely whether there are labor productivity gains and imperfect pass-throughs. We use the comparative statistics on the intensive and extensive margin of sales of exposed firms to derive equations for parameter estimation. And in particular, this will allow us to quantify the change in productivity, if any, and to measure the pass-through parameter beta and gauge whether they're really equal to 1 or not. Okay, so now that we have sort of the theoretical framework behind us, let me move on to the empirical part. So this project—
Sorry, Isabella?
Yes.
Sorry, can I ask a quick question to the slide before? So, but you're saying that you can rule out the— sorry, can you go back to the slide?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Sorry for the— because I already— yeah, you're saying that if you find negative effects on sales to MNE, you can rule out the first two scenarios. But I mean,
positive, yes.
These scenarios kind of coexist, no? So it might still be that there is a monopsony, but these other effects outweigh the monopsony effect, let's say. Yeah.
So for sure, unambiguously, the sign is positive. So if we are in a monopsonistic world, for sure the sign is unambiguously positive on the intensive margin sales of compliers. What we don't yet have is, we haven't yet done the algebra in which we combine all potential model assumptions. So the sign that I'm showing you in the third column, the one of B prime, has the assumptions A, B prime, C, and D. So you might think, what if the real world is a different combo that includes B prime? Because this model with monopsonistic labor markets is very complicated, so it's harder to derive by hand, we haven't yet done all the combos. We think that even when we derive all the combinations, we will still get that the sign will be unambiguously positive for the world in which the labor market is monopsonistic. But this is a statement that now we're making intuitively and not based on the actual derivations. But for sure, in a world in which the assumptions are A, B prime, C, and D, then the intensive margin sales of the compliers to the RSMNE would have to be positive. And if they're not positive, then we're not in this world. But I agree with you that the world could be a bit more complex and not just be the baseline model plus the monopsonistic model.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you as well.
Ludovica has a question.
Yes, Ludovica, please.
Yeah, hi, thank you. This is super interesting and outside of my depths. But so one thing I was wondering about, and when you set up the model, you said that, of course, there might be distortions because tau applies not just to the production line going out, but also to the sort of domestic.
Mm-hmm.
So is there anything in the model? So, and I guess, or put it differently, what determines sort of whether like a firm can split, so to speak? Like what keeps firms together in that case for those production lines?
So this is an excellent point. In the model, nothing. The model assumes that the firm has to apply the same tau increase to all its low-wage workers. But your empirical intuition is spot on. In everywhere in the world, not just in developing countries, but I guess in developing countries even more, firms are very creative. So you might think, well, why should I continue with all my workers under the same tax ID? Why wouldn't I not split the firm into tax IDs, for instance? So this is a great empirical point. We haven't yet done anything empirically to rule out this concern. However, something that we can do, and we will do, to alleviate this concern is to look at whether, so we have the matched employer-employee data, so we can observe groups of workers that move together to a different newly created, or not even newly created, but that move together to a different tax ID. So if this firm was to move its workers to a different tax ID within its corporate group, or if it didn't have an alternative tax ID to create a new tax ID, this is something that we would be able to observe. What we wouldn't be able to observe is if all of these workers all of a sudden go into informality. So there's not a new tax ID, but they just work under the shadows. That is not something that we would be able to shed light on. So if all of these workers would go and work in an informal shed somewhere, that's not something we can empirically rule out. But we would know that these workers are worse off because there are no more social security contributions that are made on their behalf, and all the other concerns of informality. But as long as they're moved to another formal tax ID, this is something that we could observe, and that's not necessarily a problem. We think it would be interesting to see if this is how firms react to RS. So yeah, I think that's a great point, and we really need to do more about it empirically. Thank you.
It would be awesome to see those results. I think just literature on loopholes and
yeah, we're trying to not be cynical. We are hopeful that there are these other workers that are being benefited indirectly, but it's the real world should make us more cynical, I guess. So now let me move on to the empirical part. So this project leverages a rather rare collection of cross-merged admin data, of which the most useful are the firm-to-firm transaction records and the matched employer-employee data. So these data sets, the firm-to-firm and the matched employer-employee, allow us to study the outcomes of domestic suppliers and their workers as they get exposed to RS policies that are being rolled out by their M&E buyers in Costa Rica. There are some other data sets like corporate income tax returns and customs, but these are more standard data sets. So we add to this collection of admin data a new database that is built by our team, which centralizes the RS policies that are rolled out by foreign M&Es with a subsidiary in Costa Rica. So we started our research with the 484 M&Es with a subsidiary in Costa Rica whose local purchases of inputs are larger than $1 million per year. So these are the ones that have the biggest footprint in terms of their local purchases. We then conducted a comprehensive search of all RS policy rollouts by these M&Es, both in Costa Rica specifically or at the level of the headquarters of these M&Es. In the end, we were able to find 152 RS policy rollouts by 127 distinct M&Es out of this initial set of 484. And these rollouts occurred during our analysis period, which is 2008 to 2017.
Isabela, we have a question by Shebnem.
Please.
Isabela, just a clarifying question.
Please.
I mean, great paper and great data set. So
thank you so much.
I was a little confused now when you tell us about the data in the light of
Yes.
this previous tax ID
Yes.
question. So, okay, so you identify the M&E and the domestic affiliate through this whole process, and then you have firm-to-firm IO links transactions with domestic.
Yes.
Okay, so then what do you do with the foreign link? So say that M&E owns, so I have firm A as the M&E, firm B is M&E's subsidiary in Costa Rica, firm B is linked 3 other CDE Costa Rican firms, but the M&E also supply one of those firms through some IO. So how do you deal with that? And is this, there's no indirect link like that? Everything goes through M&E's affiliate? So there is a M&E ownership thing, and there's an also IO link thing here. And IO is only domestic as far as I understand. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. So this paper at this point only is focused on links, so direct links, direct transactions between a given domestic firm in Costa Rica and an M&E subsidiary and between the subsidiary of a given M&E that is located in Costa Rica. So there has to be this local link between the subsidiary and the domestic firm. So right now, what we are not capturing are indirect links in which you are a supplier of a supplier to an M&E, or these type of linkages. Right now, we don't have them. We're studying direct linkages. We think that they are also relevant to the indirect ones. Presumably there's some decay factor in which direct linkages are the most consequential, and then as you move further and farther away from the M&E with the rollout, the suppliers are less affected. But right now we're only focusing on the direct linkages. Thank you for asking for this clarification. So for some brief context, I'm not able to give you all the descriptive stats, but in the interest of time, but I'm just going to tell you a couple. So of the M&Es with a subsidiary in Costa Rica that roll out an RS policy in our study period, 40% of them operate in manufacturing. The rest are spread out across service industries and agriculture. Most of these RS implementing M&Es are world-renowned. Think of Cisco, Walmart, Standard Fruit Company. So these are some ideas about these M&Es. On the domestic suppliers, I would say the most noteworthy fact is that most of them are actually operating in services, such as cleaning or maintenance. So rather than thinking only of large suppliers in manufacturing, one should keep in mind that the RS requirements also affect many relatively small service providers, where one would expect that the working conditions are not great to begin with. Finally, the share, as I mentioned in the introduction, the share of output from domestic formal firms that are subject to active RS codes grew from 30% to 45% during the study period. So these M&E RS rollouts have a big footprint in Costa Rica. So this is an important number to keep in mind when interpreting the welfare gains from RS. So from those of you familiar with gains from trade literature, you might think, oh, you're going to find a tiny, tiny number because the gains from trade are a small number to begin with. But you should think that the Costa Rican context, in an empirical sense, is one where the footprint of M&Es is quite large. Now, let me give you an introduction about our empirical strategy. So we use the data just described to estimate the effect of RS rollouts on outcomes at the level of suppliers, workers, and transactions, firm-to-firm transactions. So the first specification is the one for the supplier level regressions. Y is the outcome of firm I, and I is a firm that is a supplier to any M&E subsidiary in Costa Rica at some point in the sample period. S is the index for the sector of the supplier, T for years, alpha I are firm fixed effects, and gamma ST are sector by year fixed effects. In line with our theory, the domestic firms that are exposed to a given RS rollouts are those that are selling to the MNE in question the year before its RS rollout. So when you think about exposed firms, are those that are in the sort of intent to treat type of logic, the ones selling the year before the rollout. We also estimate the impact of RS rollouts at the worker level. There we really leverage the matched employer-employee data. Because of that, we're able to add a richer set of worker by firm fixed effects. So we focus on a within worker firm relationship, what happens to the outcomes of that worker. And finally, to estimate the effect on the intensive margin of sales to the RS-MNE by RS compliant suppliers, so those that continue supplying to the MNE after its rollout, we estimate event study specifications that are also at the level of firm-to-firm transactions. And here we have an estimation sample that only includes transactions where the buyer is some MNE subsidiary in the country. And another difference is that the regression is the MNE, because the regression is at the MNE transaction level, the event is now defined directly at the MNE level. Okay. Given that I'm a bit behind on time, I will not go in detail through all the identification concerns and what we do. I'm just going to give you a flavor, and I welcome you to the paper to sort of go more in detail to that. So first, a key concern that one might have is that MNEs might have targeted their RS rollouts to periods when Costa Rican suppliers experienced some other contemporaneous shocks. In order to deal with this, we will restrict the sample to only Costa Rican firms that have been suppliers to any MNE at some point during the sample period. And moreover, we will use RS policies that are rolled out at the global level as instruments for the rollouts that affect Costa Rican suppliers. So this speaks to the concern that RS rollouts might have been targeted at the precise time when some Costa Rican suppliers were hit with other relevant shocks. So again, we are instrumenting with rollouts that happen at the global level, affecting suppliers worldwide, and not just rollouts that are done for the Costa Rican subsidiary, for the subsidiary in Costa Rica. Second, there are several recent papers that have shown that estimating event study specifications with two-way fixed effects may fail to recover average treatment effects, even if the treatment was as good as randomly assigned. So if you're on Twitter, you know what I'm talking about, but even if you're not on Twitter. So for instance, this may be the case when different cohorts of treated firms over time are subject to different dynamic paths of treatment effects. So to deal with this, we're going to use the Abraham and Sum robustness check. And third and last, our definition of the rollout exposure may give rise to a somewhat mechanical bias in the event study coefficients. Why? Because we're defining the exposure to RS in terms of positive MNE sales in event year -1. And this might pick up particularly successful periods for the exposed suppliers. And this might give us, let's say, positive pre-trends and negative post-trends, even in the absence of any actual impacts of RS. And to address that, we will have an additional set of event study indicators to control for the potential full timeline of effects that might stem from having a positive sales relationship to any MNE at event year -1. So now let me start showing you the results. So I will start with the supplier level event studies. So the figure on the left presents the event study results for the log supplier total sales for the exposed firms. And as we see, the total sales of exposed firms decrease by on average 8% 4 years after the RS rollout. In the same way, the figure on the right shows a similar decline in total employment, also by 8%. Now, let me move on to the worker level event study estimates. On the left, I present the effect of RS on the labor earnings of all workers employed by suppliers exposed to an RS rollout. And here we find that their earnings increased by about 1.6% 4 years after the rollout. And the figure on the right focuses on the initially low-wage workers whose labor earnings, they increased the most at 6% 4 years after the rollout.
And sorry, Isabela, yes. I missed this. Is this conditional on being employed at T-1, or is this the stay years?
Yes, this is both. So these are workers that are employed by the firm, by the exposed firm in event year -1, and also stayers.
Okay.
So we're looking at continuous work relationships. That's what allows us to have worker by firm fixed effects. But yes, I mean, another effect that you might think of is one on the composition of workers. And this is not something that I'm showing evidence on at this point. Correct. Okay, so last, we present our transaction level event study estimates. And as displayed in this graph, we find that the sales of RS compliant firms to the RSMNE, they decline about 6.5% 4 years after the RS rollout. Okay, so this is the intensive margin of compliers that I mentioned before. So now let me go to the model selection and estimation. So far, we've shown a fall in the total sales of suppliers exposed to RS. And most importantly, for our model selection endeavor, we've shown a fall in the sales of compliers to the, so a fall in the sales to the RSMNE by the compliers, by those who remain in the relationship with the MNE. So this evidence, as I said a couple of slides back, allows us to rule out hypothesis A prime and B prime. So this allows us to rule out that the RS policy is profit maximizing. It's a profit maximizing behavior, at least in the short run. And also that the labor market in Costa Rica is monopsonistic. So in other empirical settings, one can still use our model, see what the empirical evidence tells one, and then decide what is the model variant that is suitable for that empirical setting. But in our empirical setting, we are ruling out A prime and B prime. For now, we don't take a stand on whether there are labor productivity gains or not from RS. Hence, we don't take a stand between hypothesis C or C prime, and on the size of the pass-through of the cost shock to the MNE, so between D and D prime. So basically in what comes next, we use this model, this version of the model aligned with the empirical facts to derive the necessary estimation equations for a parameter estimation and to conduct welfare counterfactual. So given time constraints, I'm going to torture you with this heavy slide. So very quickly, I'm going to tell you basically what happens in the parameter estimation part, and the paper provides more details. So we need to estimate several parameters. First, we need to estimate T hat, the labor productivity effect of new RS policies. And to estimate it, we use the effect of the RS exposure on the earnings of the initially high-wage workers who benefited from the labor productivity gain, but for whom the RS standards are non-binding in terms of the wage increase. Then, to estimate tau hat, the size of the RS-induced cost increase, theta, the shape parameter of the productivity distribution for Costa Rican firms, and beta, the pass-through rate, we use the effects of RS rollouts on 3 types of sales: the intensive margin sales of compliers to the RSMNE, the domestic sales of RS exposed suppliers, and the total sales of RS exposed suppliers. And basically these are 3 equations and 3 unknowns. We can back out the 3 parameters of interest. Then to estimate raw, the elasticity of substitution in production between the worker types, we use the change in the relative employment of low versus high wage workers, plus our estimate of theta, and this is what gives us the raw. For now in this model, we do not estimate sigma, the demand elasticity, but we take it from outside this paper. We take a value of 5.303, which is a value estimated in our previous work, Jose Alonso and I, that has the same Costa Rican context and data. So at the end, after all of this, we infer that the productivity increase from RS is of 1.4%. And again, this benefits both low and high wage workers. The labor cost shock to suppliers on their low wage workers is of 15%. So that's our tau hat. And also we find a close to complete pass-through of the increase in labor cost of suppliers to the MNE. So our beta is 0.96. So with these parameters, let me now go to the last part of the presentation, which is about the welfare effect of RS policies. What we want to do is to study the welfare incidence of RS in Costa Rica in the version of the model that we've just selected. So remember that was A, we ruled out A prime, B, we ruled out B prime, and then we don't take a stand between C and C prime, D and D prime. So we allow for there to be labor productivity gains and for beta to not be 1. So what we do in this model variant, we study the welfare incidence of moving from an initial equilibrium without RS in Costa Rica and derive expressions for the first order change in welfare that follows a small RS shock. So for simplicity, we're only reporting here the welfare effects of RS in the case where the Melitz type selection channel is shut off, but firm heterogeneity is kept. So we have the general case in the paper, the intuitions presented today survive, but the math gets messier very fast. So now let's look at the welfare change expression, the expression of the welfare change, and try to understand what's going on. So the first term, it corresponds to the effect of the net labor cost increase, that is chi tau, where chi is the share of the wage bill that corresponds to low wage workers that are impacted by the RS policy. The second term in the formula of the welfare change corresponds to the labor productivity gain coming from T hat, that is T hat. The second term, the one that I've just mentioned, is somewhat mechanical. It's unsurprisingly positive, as it corresponds to the positive effect of a pervasive labor productivity increase of all workers, W prod. And this is scaled down by the fact that not all workers are affected by the policy, only those that are in RS supply chains. More interestingly, let's focus on the first term. The first term captures the welfare impact, as I said, of chi tau, the net labor cost increase. At the heart of this term is a positive welfare effect, W tax, which is the first order effect of imposing an export tax on home exports. This is beneficial to home through classic terms of trade effects. But this positive effect can be dampened or even reversed by two effects. Why? Because RS is not quite isomorphic to an export tax only. So first, we have the fact that the lower the pass-through beta of the policy to foreign prices is, the more the terms of trade channel is muted, and therefore the lower the corresponding welfare benefits. Second, the more the policy leaks to production on the domestic market, as it's measured by lambda, lambda being the share of domestic production produced by RS firms. So the more this policy leaks to production on the domestic market, the more distortive the policy is on the domestic market. So it increases the local price more, local price index more, and reduces welfare. So basically on net, it is ex ante ambiguous on whether this expression is positive or negative, as it depends on the sign of beta, minus, which is the pass-through parameter, minus lambda, the linkage parameter. In the paper, we also look at the heterogeneous welfare effects of the policy on low versus high wage workers and show that the policy is unambiguously progressive. So now in my last 5 minutes, let me just show you some quantitative results and conclude. So our welfare results are presented quantitatively in this slide. And here they're presented as a function of the leakage parameter, of how much of the policy leaks into the domestic market, as is governed by this lambda parameter, leakage parameter. So our empirical measure of lambda, which is the one for Costa Rica, leads us to the red dots, which are our estimates. But again, the model can be applied to other empirical contexts where lambda is larger or smaller. The figure on the left decomposes the aggregate welfare effects into the productivity component, which is increasing in lambda, and the export tax component, which is decreasing in lambda. For our value of lambda, which is 0.32, the total welfare gains are of 0.3%. About a third of that comes from the export tax effect, which is positive, as the pass-through is almost full. Remember, beta was 0.96. And 2/3 of it comes from the productivity effect, which was, uninterestingly positive. The figure on the right shows the welfare effects by worker type. In our empirical setting, both types of workers gain, but these gains are mostly concentrated among the low-wage workers. And for these, their welfare increases by 1.3%. So now let me just conclude. The adoption of MNEs by MNEs of responsible sourcing policies is more and more widespread. This is sometimes at their own initiative. Sometimes you have, the governments of countries that force them to do that. If you read the Financial Times every other day or every other week, there's a new article about this type of responsible sourcing policies. We don't know as much about their effects. So to try to help in that direction, we develop a theory that allows us to think through the incidence of RS requirements. We also provide empirical evidence on its impact on the ground in the empirical context of Costa Rica. To do that, we've put together some rather rare data sets, like the firm-to-firm one, the matched employer-employee, and the one that we've created with the RS rollouts. We find that empirically, RS is not just hot air. We show that RS policies increase the wages that impacted firms, particularly for low-wage workers, and they decrease their sales and employment. And then at the end, in terms of the theory, we showed that the welfare effect of RS is a priori ambiguous. It depends on the pass-through rate, it depends on the leakage coefficient. We find that in our empirical context, it is positive, quantitatively positive. However, it's small. It was 0.3% on the aggregate, and it was 1.3% for the low-wage workers, the ones for which the policy is binding. And this is what I have. So happy to receive more comments and questions, and I'll be around after the presentation for whoever wants to chat about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isabela, for a wonderful presentation.